Hello and welcome to another screencast, this time on types of feedback. So just a reminder in terms of how the presentations work, the yellow text boxes are tasks for students, the green text boxes are note-taking sections for students, the blue text boxes are for differentiation tasks, and the red text boxes for teaching and learning strategies and ideas. So the syllabus for this specific topic asks you to recognise the different types of feedback. So you need to be able to be aware for AO1, the different types of feedback. You need to be able to apply that. So the AO2 aspect is giving examples of each type of feedback and specifically looking at the differences where applicable, where are they suited for beginner levels and for the elite level. And finally, sort of just evaluating those the effectiveness of each type of feedback, okay, on specific performers. So first and foremost, if we look at what is feedback and why do we give it? Ultimately, first of all, we need to get the definition in terms of what feedback is. So feedback is basically information a performer receives about their performance. So how well have they completed that task? Okay, and as coaches, as teachers, as teammates, or us as a performer ourselves, okay, we will take and receive that information based on how we've performed. Okay, so this might be during the event, it might be after the performance, okay, but ultimately it's that information that we receive. So pause your video here. Why is feedback important in sport? Okay, so hopefully you come up with a few different ideas as to why feedback is important in sport. And ultimately you could have mentioned any of these, and there's others as well that you could have included. Ultimately, we're trying to improve performance, aren't we? Okay, so how well a task is completed is what we mean by that word performance. And ultimately, we're trying to improve our performance ultimately. And if we get that feedback, if we get that information, we can also change our technique and we can understand how we're performing in the same vein. Ultimately, we can also look to provide extra motivation for the performer. Okay, by taking on that feedback, it might motivate us to try and improve even further. And ultimately, if we're looking to adapt and change the technique, we're also looking at this idea of trying to be more consistent. And those top level athletes, the best Olympic athletes, the best athletes out there, they're the ones that are consistent, and they're consistent under pressure, they're consistent most of the time, okay, and resulting in obviously top level performance on a regular basis. And if we're consistent, then ultimately we're going to also be efficient within our technique. So we're going to be able to have a high level of technique, a good level of technique. It might be smooth in terms of rhythm and so on. But ultimately, if it's efficient, it means we can last longer for, well, as I said, for a longer period of time in regards to our sporting performance. And ultimately, this means that we can also prevent injury. Okay, so let's look at the first aspect in terms of the different types of feedback. So we've got intrinsic and extrinsic feedback. So ultimately, intrinsic feedback is looking at this idea of where we physically feel the movement, okay, as we perform it. So as we execute that skill or that performance, the performer can feel it, okay. So we're using our sensory information within us and around us to recognize how we feel internally, okay, within the body, within our mind, of when we perform that specific movement. Whereas extrinsic is looking at providing sort of information from external sources. Okay, so again, this can be during or after performance, but ultimately it will come from things like coaches, teammates, it might even be the crowd, whether they're cheering, whether they're booing. Okay, all of that is extrinsic feedback, isn't it? It's external to us and it's coming from outside sources. And I think I need you to be aware of this word here, kinesthetic feedback. So this kind of relates to the intrinsic element, okay? So the information within us. And when we've got a good kinesthetic feedback, when we've got a good kinesthetic feel about ourselves, this is the kind of internal feedback that we get from our receptors within our muscles. We're looking at the sensory organs within our body, and ultimately it's how we feel in our performance. Okay, so think to yourself, if you've ever hit a nice volley in football, for example, okay, and you've struck it perfectly, and you know you've struck it perfectly straight away. That's that kinesthetic feel. Might be the same in tennis or in table tennis. We've hit a really good shot, and you can actually feel that you've actually hit that ball perfectly. Precise timing, exactly what you wanted, okay, and that's the kinesthetic feel. So you've got two pictures above. You've got one of a golfer and you've got one of a tennis player with their coach. Just want you to pause the video now and to explain what type of feedback is each and give your reasons. Okay, so if you look at the golfer, for instance, okay, when she's about to hit the ball, when she does hit the ball, okay, we can normally feel how well we've hit the ball in terms of our golf swing, and that will be intrinsic feedback. So that will come from internally within the performer. Whereas extrinsic is the coach perhaps giving feedback to that tennis player there. Okay, he might be saying some positive, he might be saying some negative feedback, but ultimately it's extrinsic, so it's outside source, so such as the coach. Okay, so let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of intrinsic and extrinsic feedback. So first and foremost, if we look at the advantages of intrinsic feedback, ultimately, some of the benefits of knowing how we feel within ourselves is that it can focus the performer on the feeling of the skill itself. Okay, it can also lead to things like problem solving for the performer. So if they're able to adapt to certain situations because they can recognize and they can feel perhaps what they're doing wrong. Okay, and it makes them, obviously, these performers work independently, so they can work on their own, and it gives them, the performers, more time to actually practice. At the same time, we've got advantages for the extrinsic feedback, and here, if we look at sort of the fact that coaches, teammates, the crowd, they can give us new or additional guidance, can't they? So it's a fresh pair of eyes, for example, when we're looking at a performance. It also helps the performer to identify specific and different problems, okay, and we can also sometimes offer different solutions to some of those problems that maybe the performer may have had difficulty in solving the problem themselves. And ultimately, it prevents the performers from reaching a dead end. So it provides and stimulates motivation. I've attached a BBC Bite-Size link there. I think it's really important if you just go to BBC Bite-Size and you type in types of feedback, there's a really useful video at this stage on that to help you with this particular topic. Okay, so let's look at positive and negative feedback. So ultimately here, this is exactly what it says on the tin, really. Positive feedback is this idea where we give information to the athlete and we kind of tell them when it's correct, when that movement has been perfected. And that can sometimes come from the coach themselves. You can see there in the picture in terms of celebrating with their athlete. It might come from praise, okay, verbal feedback, for example, might come from the crowd themselves, okay, in terms of cheering. So we've got that kind of positive response, okay, that positive feedback, which is is motivating the athlete. Negative feedback, on the other hand, is this idea of where we inform the athlete of what they've done incorrectly. So ultimately, we give that feedback because we're trying to change, we're trying to refine the performer's movements. It might be little aspects on their technique, or they may have done something specifically wrong. You can use this and think about it in terms of from a class point of view, so away from a sporting context, and think to yourself in terms of what behaviour system you have in place in your school. So for example, if you've done something positive, it's likely that you might get some house points or merits, for example, okay, and negative feedback would be where we might receive that detention or that sanction, okay. So ultimately, we're looking at incentives in regards to things like positive feedback and deterrence, aren't we, when we're giving negative feedback. Okay, and then we've also got knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. Okay, so knowledge of results looks at this idea, and it's referred to as are, but basically it focuses on the outcome. Okay, so have we achieved what we set out to achieve? And ultimately we recognize and we realize that from the end outcome. So it could be from specific stats, it could be from the end score line, for example. Okay, that would be the knowledge of results. Whereas the knowledge of performance, on the other hand, comes from feedback, the information that we get on the actual task that we've just been doing. Okay, so ultimately this could be, for example, if we took a free throw shot in basketball, okay, and the coach gave us some feedback and said, excellent extension of the elbow. That would be knowledge of performance. Okay, so we're not really looking at the result. Okay, the coach hasn't mentioned about the fact that whether the ball has gone in or not, but actually it's been referring more to the technique. Okay, so as it says there, knowledge of performance provides details about how well you did irrespective of the result. It may relate to the technique or specific aspects of the movements produced. Again, pause the video here and see if you can come up with any other examples, okay, of knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. Okay, let's now look at applying that feedback, first and foremost to a beginner, and then we're going to look at an elite performer. But ultimately, if we're looking at beginner performers, first of all, they tend to respond better to positive feedback, knowledge of results, and extrinsic feedback. Again, I want you to pause your video now. I want you to have a think about this. And in your own words, once you've written that down, I want you underneath to explain, try and justify why do they tend to respond better to positive feedback, knowledge of results, and extrinsic feedback. Okay, off you go, have a go. Okay, so hopefully you've got some ideas down, and these are some things that you could have mentioned. So positive feedback, as I've said before, strengthens that response to repeat the behavior. Ultimately, as human beings, we like to please and satisfy people, okay? And ultimately, when we get positive feedback, we feel good about ourselves, don't we? So we tend to repeat that behavior, especially when we're a lot younger as well. Knowledge of results looks at this kind of understanding the outcome better than compared with the technique of the skill. So as a beginner, we perhaps don't know all the elements, all the key points of that technique. But what we do know is whether we've achieved it or not. Okay, so as a beginner, we're pretty confident and able to figure out of whether we kicked that ball into the goal or not, or whether it went wide or whether it went over. Okay, so we've got a good knowledge of results, and that's why we tend to respond better to that type of feedback. And ultimately, we look at extrinsic feedback because we don't have that internal, we don't have that information yet in regards to our understanding, because we're at beginner level. Okay, ultimately, we're relying on knowledge of others, aren't we? We're relying on knowledge of the coach, the experts, okay, those that have perhaps got more experience than us. Now let's try and do the same for applying feedback to elite performers. Okay, so these guys obviously tend to respond better to negative feedback, knowledge of performance, and intrinsic feedback. Again, pause your video here and see if you can justify why an elite performer will respond better to these types of feedback. Okay, so hopefully you've come up with a few different ideas. I mean, elite performers will want some positive feedback, and I think it's important to make a note of that, that we don't want to give always just negative feedback, but ultimately elite performers tend to respond better to negative feedback at times, because ultimately it helps motivate them, it helps them adapt and change little bits of their technique, okay, and ultimately it means that they can get those marginal gains. We're talking about those extra 1% gains to achieve success at elite performance. We also want knowledge of performance because as experts, they already have that greater knowledge, they have that greater understanding of the technical aspects of the skill. So they understand what they need to do in terms of it could be biomechanics at A level. Okay, so ultimately we're looking at it more from maybe a sports science point of view. That's why that knowledge of performance can sometimes be better than the result itself. And ultimately, intrinsic feedback they tend to respond better to, because ultimately, as they're elite, okay, they have that high level of knowledge. So ultimately, they're going to respond better to the kinesthetic feedback that they will have internally. Okay, finally, just in terms of teaching and learning strategies, teachers, obviously, I think role play at this stage, as you can read through there, can help, and sometimes the paired work elements can help within this specific task. And I would get my students to plan an essay and encourage them to kind of link some topics, such as the types of guidance and types of feedback.